All right, well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get ourselves started for today. This is Political Science 11. This is our weekly Zoom get together. It is Monday, the 18th of May, 2020, and several things we want to go ahead and accomplish this morning. First off, in just a couple of minutes, going to go ahead and spend a few minutes talking about some announcements, reminders, that sort of thing. Remember, there's not that much time left for this class, not that much time left in the spring 2020 semester. I know it feels like we've been doing this semester for like the last 2 years, but we're almost done. And so I want to highlight for you the remaining assignments that you have to complete, the remaining due dates, remind you about some of the grading policies for the class, that sort of thing, so that you are ready to hit the ground running and finish the semester strong. So that's the first thing that we'll do. Then we'll spend the rest of our time today, first of all, dealing with any questions that you might have, dealing with, first of all, the discussion forum post assignment that you have due this coming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And that is the assignment dealing with the age of organization. And then finally, I will spend the rest of our time today highlighting some of the notes, some of the information for the last section of information, the second last bit of new content that we'll be dealing with anyway in this class, talking a little bit, first of all, about another fundamental shift in Western political philosophy. I'm going to be highlighting a few things from chapter 11 in your Wolin book, entitled From Modern to Postmodern Power. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some highlights, specifically some really persistent myths that Wolin tries to explode, tries to blow up in chapter 12 of the reading in Wolin, dealing with Karl Marx, probably one of the most controversial political philosophers in the modern world, and still today, even though he's been gone physically for quite some time. So we'll highlight some of the notes from Marx as well. And that's pretty much what we are going to be dealing with in here today. So that is pretty much what we have going on. Why don't we go ahead and get started? And first of all, let me go ahead and do the announcements and reminders. So you should have received a Canvas message from me towards the end of last week, a Canvas announcement, actually, I should say, reminding you about some upcoming assignments as we rapidly get to the end of the semester. And specifically, that Canvas announcement talked both about the Students' Choice Project, which is going to be due next Wednesday, pardon me. That is the 27th of May at 11:59 p.m., plus the grace period, of course. And I also gave you a reminder about part 2 of the pre-post project, since we hadn't talked about that in quite a while, since the beginning of the semester anyway. So I opened up the assignment guidelines for the pre-post project last week and reminded you in the Canvas message that that assignment is due along with your last test, test number 3, on the very last day of our semester, which is Wednesday, June 3rd. So 2 weeks from this Wednesday. So basically at this point, you have 4 assignments left. You have the postmodern power discussion forum post, which is due this Wednesday. You also have the Students' Choice Project, part 2 of the pre-post, as well as test number 3. And all of the guidelines for all of those assignments are now up and available for you to access on our class Canvas page by clicking on the assignments tab and scrolling around and looking for those assignments. So first of all, again, the Students' Choice Project, if you haven't yet started working on that yet, now would be a good time for you to go ahead and get started with that. And if it's been a while, if you started work on the Students' Choice Project, like I said, you want to get going with it sooner rather than later, because again, it is due a week from this Wednesday, so the 27th of May. Now, if you haven't looked at the project guidelines for a while, remember I did go ahead and make some changes that generally I think work in your favor for the Student's Choice Project. Main thing that I did once the class was fully moved online for the remainder of the semester is I went ahead and I reduced the minimum page requirement for the Student's Choice Project. And I did that, in fairness, because, quite frankly, moving this class online creates additional work for you, creates additional stress for you. And I only thought it fair to bring the minimum down. So the minimum was dropped for everybody, but I also dropped the page minimum further for those of you who originally were planning on doing the community service learning option for the Student's Choice Project. So if you did that and at least completed the BLAST training, your minimum page requirement is even a little bit lower. So again, if you haven't started the project, get started. If you haven't looked at it in a while, get back to it. And if you have any questions, comments about the Student's Choice Project, problems with it going forward between now and the due date, please do feel free to reach out to me by email, by Canvas message, or you can also drop into my twice weekly virtual student hours. And remember, those are every Monday and Wednesday. So I'll be doing it one later today. Every Monday and Wednesday from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if you want to access me via Zoom on a one-on-one basis through those virtual student hours, just go to our Class Canvas homepage, scroll down past the pictures to the section labeled Basic Course Information, and there you will find the link, the Zoom link for those virtual student hours, as well as the password that you will need to access them. Now, if you want a one-on-one Zoom meeting with me for whatever reason, and you're not able to make it during those twice weekly virtual student hours, no worries, we can make it work. Just send me an email or a Canvas message. Give me a few days and times when you would be available to meet with me one-on-one via Zoom, and I'll find one that works for me. I'll send you a custom Zoom link and password for that meeting, and we can go from there. So please do not hesitate. If you have any questions, comments, problems dealing with the Student's Choice Project. And first of all, are there any questions right now at the moment regarding that Student's Choice Project? Is everybody good with that? Any general questions about the project at this stage? And for any questions or comments throughout our hour together today, as always, please feel free to unmute your mic, ask your question, make your comment, or if you would rather, just go ahead and place your question or comment in the group chat, and I will deal with it from there. So we're good as far as the Student's Choice Project goes for now? Okay, great. So again, also another assignment that will be coming due, and I should say, for the Student's Choice Project, as for every assignment that we do this semester, the 3-day grace period policy does apply. So even though the project is technically due a week from this coming Wednesday, that is the 27th, you will in fact have until May 30th at 11:59 p.m. to actually complete the project, submit it to me via Canvas. And if you get that submitted to me within the 3-day grace period, I will not deduct any points from your score for lateness. So that applies for all the discussion forum posts, for the Student's Choice Project, for the tests, as well as for part 2 of the pre-post assignment. And speaking of the pre-post assignment, I wanted to talk about that for a couple of minutes because that's something that we really haven't dealt with since the beginning of the semester. If you can think back to our very first class meeting of the semester, and again, it seems like a couple years ago now at this point with everything that's happened to us since, right? But on our very first class meeting, before we talked about the syllabus, before we did any material dealing with the class, I went ahead and had you do our first in-class writing assignment, and that was pre-post part 1. And the idea behind the pre-post project, as I explained to you at the beginning of the semester, was for me to get an understanding of how much you're learning, how much you're understanding of a very central concept for the class would grow over the course of the semester. So it makes sense if I was trying to measure your growth and understanding of a central concept for us, like the good life, which is what I had you write about, it makes sense that I would need to figure out at the very beginning of the semester, before you did any of the assigned readings, before we had any in-class discussions or anything like that, it made sense that I was able to measure your baseline knowledge on the topic of the good life. That's why I had you do pre-post part 1. Okay, so now that we've gotten towards the end of the semester, I want to ask you about the good life once again. And I want to ask you a few questions about the good life so that, again, I can measure how much your thinking and learning and understanding of the subject has grown over the course of the semester. And that's where pre-post part 2 comes in. And the pre-post part 2 project is pretty straightforward. It's not going to take you a great amount of time to do. It is basically a 5-paragraph essay. And let me just go ahead and pull it up on my other screen so I can refer to it. Actually, wrong screen. 1 second. Got all these things on all these different screens. Hang on, I will find it. There we go. So basically, pre-post part 2 is simply an essay, an approximately 5-paragraph essay. And as you see, when you look at the assignment guidelines that I have up for you on Canvas, 3 basic parts to your 5-paragraph response. The first one is for you to give me a thorough definition of what we mean in Western political philosophy when we talk about the concept of the good life. So give me a good, thorough, working definition of the good life. That's the first thing that you want to put in your response. Then I want you to think about this. I ask, how and why is the concept of the good life relevant to the study of philosophy in general and political philosophy in particular? So I want you to think a little bit about how this idea of the good life has come up throughout the course of the semester, as we've talked about different philosophers over different historical time periods. Tell me a little bit about the relevance of this idea of the good life. How central is having a thorough understanding of the good life? How central is this for different political philosophers in coming up with their philosophical models? And then finally, the third part of the essay is having you take a look, really trying to apply the concept of the good life to where we are here and now in mid-May in 2020. So the third part of the prompt asks this: briefly describe your personal vision of the good life. What role, if any, must government play to help you fulfill your vision of the good life over time? Explain. And to what extent has your perception of the good life changed as a result of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis? Explain. Because if you think back to the part 1 essay that you wrote in class at the beginning of the semester, I asked you about this, right? I asked you, what is your personal vision of the good life? And what I would be interested to know is, now that we've gotten to the end of the semester, now that you've learned all this stuff relating to the good life in Western political philosophy, and now that you have been living for at least, what, about 2.5 months with this unprecedented COVID-19 crisis, I'm wondering how, if at all, your vision of the good life maybe is different now than it was at the beginning of the semester. Has your vision of the good life changed because of what you've learned about in class, or has your vision of the good life changed now that our lives have essentially been turned upside down by this ongoing COVID-19 saga. So those are the three parts of the prompt. And again, you're responding in approximately 5 paragraphs and submitting your response to me through Canvas, either through a text entry box or by uploading a docx, or PDF file. And that's pretty much what's going on with that. So are there any questions, comments, problems at this time dealing with part 2 of that pre-post project? And remember, that is due on the very last day of the semester, Wednesday, June 3rd at 11:59 p.m. And again, the 3-day grace period applies for that assignment too. So you will have until June 6th at 11:59 p.m. to submit your assignment to me without a grade penalty for lateness. So any questions about pre-post part 2 at this time? Anybody? Well, okay. And again, if questions come up between now and June 3rd, you know what to do. Email, Canvas message, virtual student hours, do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered. Now, the last assignment that I should talk about, and it is now open and available for you to access on Canvas, is test number 3. Now, test number 3 is the exact same format as test number 2. So the same 2 parts, just like last time. In part 1, you are responding in about 3 to 4 sentences each to 8 of the terms that I have listed, any 8 of the terms that I have listed for you on part 1 of the test. And I give you quite a few terms to choose from. So pick the 8 that you think you can do the best job of answering. And in a few sentences each, for each of those 8 terms, you are giving me a basic, thorough definition of that concept. And you're also telling me how and why that concept is significant for us. How is it important to us? How does it connect? How does it relate to some of the major things that we've been talking about and learning about in this class during the course of the semester? As always, each of your 8 responses in part 1 are worth 7.5 points each, which gets us to 60 points possible for part 1 of the test. And part 2, as always, is your response in approximately 5 paragraphs, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, whatever you need to do to answer the question thoroughly. It's your response in about 5 paragraphs to a brief essay question. I give you a number of essay questions there on the study guide or on the test to choose from, including the option to create your own question and give me what you think would be a model full point answer for that question. And your response in part 2, again, in about 5 paragraphs, is worth the remaining 40 points possible for the test. And just like the pre-post project part 2, test number 3 is due on the very last day of the semester, Wednesday, June 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Plus, you also have the additional 3-day grace period to get that submitted to me as well. Now, speaking of the tests, right? Because remember when we talked at the beginning of the semester about the grading system and how the assignments are counted and things that I try and do to make this class as fair as possible for you and to give you every reasonable chance to be successful in this class. You may recall at the beginning of the semester, and it's still true, if you look on our homepage on Canvas, you'll see this policy is still in effect. At the end of the semester, I automatically drop your lowest test score and do not count it towards your final course grade. Now, remember, originally, back when the class was still face-to-face, we were having 4 tests and I was only going to count your highest 3. Once we made the movement online and once it became obvious that we were going to spend the rest of the semester online, again, for purposes of, making sure that your workload was fair and balanced and not too much, I went down from 4 tests to 3. But even though we cut out 1 test, the low score drop policy still applies for the test. So we have 3 tests, but at the end of the semester, I am only counting your highest 2 test scores. Now, this is important because this gives you some options depending on your circumstances in this class. So if we've taken 2 tests so far, if you have missed one of the first 2 tests that we've given so far this semester, then you definitely need to take test number 3, because I want to have 2 test scores available for you so that you can end up getting a good grade in this class. So if you either miss test number 1 or miss test number 2, definitely take test number 3, please, for the sake of your grade, right? Now, on the other hand, though, and also if you've taken the first 2 tests and one of those first 2 test scores is lower than you would like it to be, then I would encourage you, if at all possible, to take test number 3 as well. Try and do a better job with test number 3, so at the end of the semester, Canvas drops that low score that maybe you would like to get rid of, right? Now then there's the third option. If you have taken the first 2 tests in this class for this semester and you have aced them, if you have done extremely well on test number 1 and test number 2, and if you feel like that you can't really do better on test number 3 than you did on either of your first 2 test scores, then you have the option, if you so choose, to simply not take test number 3. Don't turn anything in, and that will be the score that Canvas drops. And I'll count the 2 really great test scores that you've already had. So you have some flexibility here. So again, if you've done really well in the first 2 tests, and looking at my grade book, I know that there are a number of you who have. If you've aced those first 2 tests, then seriously consider, don't even worry about test number 3. I'm sure at this late stage of the semester, you have plenty of other things to do in other classes, other tests. Maybe you've got some comprehensive final exams in other classes. Maybe you have papers due in other classes, presentations, who knows what else. But you do have that option if you did a great job with test number, with the first 2 tests. So that's how it works. And hopefully, Tita, that, see, I have a question. Do I still have to do it? Yeah. And that's what we just said. Yeah, no, you don't have to take test number 3 if you are happy with your first 2 test scores. And that's just my way of rewarding you for, your really good efforts during the course of the semester. Does that make sense? Any questions about that low score drop policy for the tests? And remember, the low score drop policy also applies for our discussion forum post assignments that we have been taking all semester. And I'm just scrolling back to our homepage on Canvas for a second, just to remind myself about something, just to make sure that I am speaking correctly on this, right? Yeah, so at this point, and let me pull up another page here, 1 second. So by the time you turn in your last discussion forum post this Wednesday, we will have taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We will have had 7 discussion forum assignments during the course of the semester. And the same low score drop policy applies as I have for the test. So at the end of the semester, Canvas will automatically drop the lowest of your 7 discussion forum post assignments. Okay, so again, that way, if for some reason you missed one of the discussion forum post assignments and you are unable to make that missing assignment up before the end of the semester, don't worry about it. That will be the one that Canvas drops, and I'll count the other 6 scores that you have. By the same token, If you've done really well on the first 6 discussion forum post assignments that I've given you, and you don't want to do the last one due on Wednesday, you don't have to, and that will be the score that I drop. So in the end, your lowest test score of the 3 drops and your lowest discussion forum post score of the 7 also automatically drop at the end of the semester. Okay? So at this point, it's a lot of information. Any questions about anything having to do with the remaining assignments due in the class? Any questions about anything having to do with the grading system, the low score drop policy, anything like that before we move on and talk a little bit about the movement from modern to postmodern power, plus a little bit about Marx? So anything about the class generally before we move on? Okay, great. And Jamie says, thank you so much. Well, you're welcome. That's what I'm here for. And I want, and I also should, I do want to thank you all again too, because, getting together here week after week on Monday mornings at 10 o'clock, I pretty much see pretty consistently the same group of students on this Zoom. And, I really do appreciate you showing up week after week. I know these assignments are voluntary. You don't have to be here. You don't get participation points for being here or anything like that. So I really do appreciate you coming and joining me every week. And I'm glad, thanks, as Walter just said, he enjoys the lectures. I appreciate that. And I'm glad for your participation. I'm glad for your questions. I'm glad for your comments. I'm very grateful for the really wonderful thinking that you demonstrate during these weekly meetings. So thank you for being here. I do appreciate it. It makes my job doing this a lot more gratifying because, I got to tell you something. My favorite part of doing what I do is being able to be in the classroom and interact with you folks in class in real time. That's the greatest joy that I get in this job. And so, the movement of all of our classes online, it was necessity. We had to do it, no question, but it took away a lot of what I really like best about doing what I do, and that is the real-time interaction with all of you. So these weekly get-togethers really help me too. And so I am really grateful. It means a lot. And I know you're all going to be glad when the semester is over, and I'm going to be glad too, because we all need some time to recoup and recover and move forward and all that sort of thing. But I tell you, I'm going to miss y'all. Both the in-class discussions that we had earlier in the semester and what we've been doing together here on Zoom. I'm going to miss you. So I am going to be a little bit sad when we get to the end of the semester. So I just wanted to mention that right now. Okay, so enough sentimentality from me. Let's go ahead and talk about some material because that's the best stuff anyway. So remember, you have just one discussion forum post assignment left, and that is the one due this Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. plus the grace period, dealing with this transition from modern to postmodern power. So I want to talk a little bit about that subject. That's Wolin chapter 11, and as well as talk a little bit about Marx as well, Wolin chapter 12. And as hopefully you have noticed, I put up all of the notes, actually all the notes for the remainder of the semester. I put up this week's class notes and also next week's class notes up on the modules page on Canvas. So everything that you need in terms of material for the rest of the semester is now up and available for you. But if you've had a chance, and hopefully you've had a chance by this point, to get into reading chapter 11 and chapter 12 in Wolin and look at the videos and all that sort of thing. But chapter 11, it's interesting because it kind of is sandwiched. Obviously, chapter 11 is sandwiched in between chapter 10 and chapter 12. probably didn't need to say that. You probably could figure that out on your own. But what's interesting about that is that little chapter 11, chapter 11 is really pretty brief. It's not that many pages. It's about maybe 10, 12 pages, something like that. And it is stuck between the massive chapter 10, dealing with the age of organization, and the equally massive chapter 12, dealing with our good buddy Karl Marx, the father of communism, right? Now, because chapter 11 is so brief, relatively speaking, compared with chapter 10 and chapter 12, I think often for students as they're going through and reading Wolin, there is this temptation, say, oh, I've got so much reading to do. I'm just going to skip chapter 11 because it's not that many pages. It can't be all that important. I'm just going to go straight from chapter 10 to chapter 12. And, and that's what I'm going to do. Right. And I hope that you didn't do that. And if you have, I would encourage you to go back and really carefully read through chapter 11, A, because it's short, and B, because your discussion forum post assignment for this week doesn't specifically deal with Marx in chapter 12. It specifically deals with chapter 11 and the transition from modern to postmodern power. And the reason why I did that, the reason why the discussion forum post for this week is not about Marx is, and trust me, if you look at test number 3, there's a number of things about Marx on test number 3 that you could answer if you want to. But I wanted to make sure that people didn't skip over chapter 11. And that's why I specifically made this week's discussion forum post focused on chapter 11, because chapter 11 is brief, it's short, but it's really darn powerful. Wolin packs a lot of punch into chapter 11. It was really important, one of these really important transitional chapters in his book. And so let's take a look. Let's spend a few minutes taking a look at some of the notes that I've given you for chapter 11 from our modules page on Canvas, because this is really important stuff. And honestly, when I reread chapter 11 last week, because I go through and I reread Wolin every semester so that, I'm keeping up with all of you on the assignment, which means I've read the book, like at this point, probably, oh my gosh, probably about 12 or 13 times at this point. But it's interesting. Every time I reread Wolin, I come up with new stuff that I hadn't noticed before. And the thing that really struck me as I was rereading chapter 11 last week in preparation for our get together this morning is, I was really kind of struck. It was really almost kind of breathtaking just how relevant chapter 11 is to what we are experiencing in the United States right now, kind of some of the political ramifications of this ongoing COVID-19 crisis that we are dealing with. So let's talk about some of the ideas from the chapter and go from there. So if you have the notes from chapter 11 from Canvas in front of you, let's take a look at this. So take a look at point 1. Let's start at the beginning, right? And look what it says there. It says that as we move through modern to postmodern conceptions of power. So as we move from the age of organization into the age of Karl Marx and some other philosophers that we'll be talking about, Francis Bacon, next week and this week, look what it says there. As we move through modern to postmodern conceptions of power, it becomes obvious that in order to move new visions of political philosophy and society forward, the philosopher must completely destroy past theoretical visions. The philosopher must completely destroy past theoretical visions. This is something new. This is something that we really haven't dealt with so far during the course of the semester. And I then give you a quote from Wolin on page 393. Wolin says that collective identity is not only built of positive assertions, and here's the key bit, but made possible by selective memory loss, a rearrangement of remembrance and forgetting that forms the collective memory. And Wolin doesn't highlight the phrase collective memory, I do, right? And he goes on to say, for a new identity to take hold, an existing understanding has to be repressed, redefined, or overcome. Listen to that last sentence again. For a new identity to take hold, an existing understanding has to be repressed, redefined, or overcome. And as Wolin notes in the next quote I give you, point capital A under 1 from 394, this process of collective memory loss, this process of societal forgetting, begins with philosophers like that we've already talked about, like Thomas Hobbes. Well, Wolin says, well, I say, Hobbes provides us with the necessary process for forgetting past notions of power. And then Wolin says, quote, history, Hobbes declared, is a mere register of fact, useful in making prudential, meaning careful, cautious, reasonable decisions, but too bound to a particular context to be of service in the quest for nothing but general, eternal, and immutable truth. Now, let's let all this sink in for a second, and let's understand what Wolin and Hobbes and folks going forward like Francis Bacon and Karl Marx, what they're trying to get across. Now, think from the very beginning of the semester. You know, we've talked again and again and again about how subsequent Western political philosophers, as they are creating their analytical, their philosophical models, on the one hand, they are creating new ideas, new patterns of thinking, new ways of organizing ideas that are based on their own time, place, and circumstance, right? And we've talked about that a lot, that a particular philosopher's theory is going to be very significantly, very fundamentally shaped by what, you know, they are living through in their society at that particular point in history. But we've also emphasized throughout the semester that, you know, these contemporary circumstances that a particular philosopher is living through is not the only influence on their theory, not the only influence on their thinking. That most philosophers, at least up until this point in Western political philosophical history, most philosophers are also being influenced in their thinking, in their theory, in their ideas by what has come before them, the ideas and philosophers that have come before them, right? And so, you know, so many of the folks that we've talked about throughout the semester to this point have been fundamentally influenced by folks like Plato and Aristotle. And, you know, we talked about how even someone like Machiavelli was influenced by Augustine and Aquinas and people like that. So, you know, up until this point, most Western philosophers owed a significant intellectual debt to their predecessors, going all the way back to Plato and the other ancient Greeks. But now, starting with folks like Hobbes, as we are starting to move from a modern conception of power to what we consider a postmodern or very contemporary conception of power, we see a change in that thinking. Hobbes and Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, who we won't be talking about this semester, unfortunately, because we just don't have the time to get to him, and Francis Bacon and people like that, they say, you know, guess what? We envision effective, useful political philosophy in a different way. Because look at what Hobbes is saying there in that quote, point capital A under 1, or what Wollen's saying. History, Hobbes declared, is a mere register of fact. It's useful in making prudential decisions, but too bound to a particular context to be of service in the quest for nothing but general, eternal, and immutable truth. Now, that is Hobbes and Wollen's really fancy way of saying a very simple and powerful thing. For postmodern philosophers, starting with Hobbes and moving forward, they say, look, if you're trying to be a political philosopher, if you are trying to create meaningful political theory that is going to be of use for a long period of time, if you are trying to discover eternal truths, then you have to clear your mind of history. You have to do everything you possibly can to forget about what has happened in the past, right? Forget about past history, because all past history is going to do is cloud your vision as a philosopher, cloud your judgment. It's going to mess up your thinking, right? So that's the biggest shift that we see as we move from the earlier classical liberal philosophers and Machiavelli and people like that to folks like Bacon and Marx and Nietzsche and other people like that. They're saying, just forget about history. If you want to create useful, really universally applicable philosophy, political theory today, you have to focus on the here and now. And you also have to have an eye on trying to predict the future. If you get stuck in the ideas of the past, the thinking of the past, the history of the past, then you're going to get all messed up. And your philosophy is not going to be any good to anybody. And so that is why we have this emphasis on collective memory loss or selective memory loss. This idea, well, and it's interesting. It kind of makes me think of a very famous quote from someone who was by no means a philosopher. I'm thinking about Henry Ford. Now, if that last name sounds familiar, Henry Ford was the guy who created the Ford Motor Company. So Henry Ford was the first guy to basically mass produce cars, mass produce automobiles in the United States. And he was considered this amazing industrial innovator. He was the guy that came up with the idea of mass producing products like cars by creating them, building them on an assembly line. No one had ever thought of mass producing products in that way before. So Henry Ford was this amazing industrial innovator. And as the creator of the Ford Motor Company, he became this extremely wealthy. He was the top 1% of his time in the United States in the early 20th century. So Henry Ford was a lot of things. He was not a philosopher. But it's interesting because Henry Ford, one of his most famous quotes, is actually very consistent with the philosophical vision of folks like Hobbes and Marx and Francis Bacon and Friedrich Nietzsche and people like that. And it's only a 3-word quote. That's all. Henry Ford very famously said to a reporter, "History is bunk." Bunk, B-U-N-K. Now, bunk is not a word that we commonly use in the English language anymore. I guess the more sanitized definition of bunk would be garbage, trash. The less sanitized version would be the 4-letter word that starts with S, ends with T, and has high in the middle. You get the idea? So basically, Henry Ford says, Forget about history. History teaches us nothing. All history does is mess us up. And if you think about it, from the context that Henry Ford was coming from, that makes a lot of sense. History is bunk. It's garbage. Because think about what Ford did. Ford was the first guy in this country to mass produce cars, the first person to use an assembly line, the first person to create these big industrial factories. So think about it. In Ford's mind, history was bunk because Ford is thinking, look, if I had tried to produce cars the way people used to build cars, one at a time, you put all the parts in one vehicle, get everything done, and then you move to the next one. Ford said, if I stuck doing that, I would never get anywhere. I wouldn't be able to mass produce anything. So for Ford, history was bunk. The past way of building cars was garbage, not worth it, slows you down. He's innovating, looking forward, looking to the future. And that's exactly what Wolin is talking about, the big shift that postmodern philosophers make. History is bunk. History is garbage. History just clouds our thinking. If we want to make really good, universally useful philosophy now, we have to look at the present time, and we have to try as best we can to predict into the future. Okay? And that is the key point that you really need to know, that you really need to understand, as for the philosophers that we see between now and the end of the book and the end of the semester. So does that make sense so far? Questions about this, comments, problems, complaints? How are we doing with this? Are we good? Are we making sense? Okay. Oh, wait, I have one. We have a yes, it makes sense. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So we're good so far. Last chance for questions on this idea of collective memory loss. Okay, great. So let us move on. And so let's go down to point capital B under 1, because I think this is another key piece in helping you kind of get your head around the discussion forum post assignment for this week. And so take a look at what it says there. And I start off with a rather lengthy quote from Wolin on page 394. And look what it says. It says, for theorists of the postmodern era, however, the contrast between appearance and reality no longer holds. And here's the key line, at least according to me, take it for what it's worth. Appearance is all that there is, which might seem to spell the death of reality. Now listen to that again. Appearance is all that there is, which might seem to spell the death of reality. And then Wolin goes on to say, in late modernity, meaning as we get to the end of the modern period of philosophy, the sovereignty of appearance is dependent upon incessant and insistent changes that undermine confidence in the existence of a reality principle. Now, keep that fancy sounding phrase in your mind for a minute, a reality principle. Okay. In the rituals of postmodern power, the true sovereign is disappearance. It has assumed the role of reality, of that power which abides and presides over the world of disappearances. Now, this is really deep stuff. And it's also really important stuff not just in understanding this transition to the postmodern political philosophers that Wollen's talking about in chapter 11, but also, I think, in understanding where we are in terms of our political discourse right here, right now in the United States on the 18th of May, 2020. Now, there's a lot of fancy language here. It has assumed the role of reality of that power which abides and presides over the world of disappearances. This idea that perhaps we no longer have in the United States today what we might call a reality principle. Now, let's talk a little bit about what that means. Have you ever heard, especially if you pay attention to, political news in the kind of the mainstream US media, have you ever heard, especially, really, this is something that began during the presidency of Barack Obama. You began to hear a couple of phrases that were mentioned, but this idea, and it's really come out in the last, 3.5 years of the Donald Trump presidency. Have you ever heard folks in the media talk about the fact that the U.S. or the allegation that the U.S. has become a post-truth or a post-fact society? Have you ever heard someone say in the media, well, there is no truth anymore. There is no universally accepted set of facts for any issue. All there is opinion. And so when we say that we are in a post-truth or a post-fact society, the allegation is that we can look at any issue. We can look at COVID-19. And I can say, well, I have my interpretation of what is the truth of the COVID-19 situation. But guess what? My truth might not be your truth. Your truth, your vision of the reality of the COVID-19 situation might be the exact opposite of mine. And that's okay. Now, this creates all kinds of challenges. This creates all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of problems, especially in a democratic political system, right? Especially in a representative democracy, such as the one that we have in the United States today. Because, think about it. If government in a representative democracy like the US, if government is going to accomplish anything, if government is going to get anything done in terms of creating new laws, new rules, new regulations, new pieces of government policy, new programs, that sort of thing, then the folks, our elected representatives in Congress and in the White House, need to be able to agree on a path forward. They have to agree on an interpretation of the facts. They have to be able to define what the problem is that they're trying to solve. And then they have to agree on a plan, a law, a rule, a regulation, a government program, whatever it is that they can agree is the best chance of either solving that problem, or if that problem can't be completely solved, at least mitigating that problem, making the problem less severe than it used to be, right? And if you've already taken Poli-Sci 1 or Poli-Sci 1H, you know this, that the folks who wrote the US Constitution, those fun classical liberals known as the framers, they intentionally created our system that way. They intentionally created a system where the only way that government gets things done is through consensus and through compromise. And that consensus and compromise is not just required of our elected political leaders, but it's also required of ourselves as the American public. Because in a representative democracy, our elected representatives are supposed to do what we, the people, tell them to do, right? But do you see the problem here? Do you see the challenge? Do you see the difficulty? Because here's the thing, right? What if we, the people, can't agree? What if we, the people, can't agree on a shared vision of the facts of a particular situation? What if we, the people, can't agree on the nature and extent and depth of the COVID-19 crisis? Because if we, the people, can't agree on the facts, on the reality, if we can't create a reality principle about COVID-19, then we also can't agree. We also can't reach consensus or agreement on what needs to be done to deal with that problem. And if we, the people, can't agree either on the problem or on the best solution, then guess what? Our elected political leaders need to do it for us, but they can't seem to do it either. Because there's no shared reality principle between Democrats and Republicans, whether we're talking about the American people themselves or our elected representatives in Congress and the White House. There is no agreement. There is no reality principle. And part of why there is no reality principle is because we have collectively forgotten history. We have dealt with pandemics in this country before, not of the magnitude of COVID-19. Well, actually, we have dealt with pandemics of the magnitude of COVID-19. You know, there was the influenza epidemic in 1918 in the United States and worldwide. That was incredibly devastating. And we learned a lot from things that we did right and things that we did wrong in 1918. We have the very successful federal response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa several years ago. But we've collectively forgotten, or at least segments of our population have collectively forgotten. Say, well, history is bunk. That doesn't matter. That was then, this is now. And because of our collective memory loss, well, in part because of our collective memory loss, we seem to be unable to agree on a reality principle today. Some of us say, well, listen to what the scientists are saying, the epidemiologists, the infectious disease specialists. Let's hear what they have to say. And those are the exact folks we listened to in the Ebola crisis a number of years ago. Some of us are listening to them today. Some of us are not. And they're saying, well, but just because they're specialists, they're experts, doesn't mean that they're right. Doesn't mean that we can trust them. And there are these rising conspiracy theories that are out there. Maybe you've seen this documentary called Plandemic that's out there in cyberspace, alleging that COVID-19 was created intentionally to disrupt the world, to disrupt the United States, supposedly by Bill Gates. So look at what's happening now. What's happening in the United States right now, for better or for worse, I'm not putting value judgments on this because that's not for me to do, right? But what's happening in the US right now regarding COVID-19 is a textbook example of what Wolin is talking about in chapter 11. This idea of collective memory loss. This idea that history is bunk. We're back to Henry Ford. The disappearance of a shared reality principle. and the movement to a post-truth, post-fact society. Does that all make sense? Questions about this, comments, reactions, complaints? Hit me with it. Are we good with all of this? Anything that you want to say, questions or things to add, or challenge me on something? I'm here. I can take it. Unmute your mic, put something in the group chat, let me know. We're good? Well, okay. Wow. It's 11 o'clock already. Time flies when you're having fun, or at least time seems to fly when I'm having fun. I hope that, this has been great for you as well. Look, so we're out of time. And I wanted to at least talk a little bit about Marx, even though you don't have a discussion forum post deals with chapter 11, but I wanted to get a little bit into Marx. So if you can stick with me for like about 5 more minutes, that'd be great. If you have to go now, I understand. But if you can stick with me for 5 more minutes, I at least want to show you what I've done with the notes that I gave you on Canvas for chapter 12, dealing with Marx, kind of the first really sort of postmodern philosopher that we get to after Bacon, certainly way more controversial than Bacon. And so what I've done for the notes on Marx, because I kind of had this feeling that I wasn't going to have a lot of time to talk with you about Marx. And so what I did, because the chapter 12 is rather lengthy and rather detailed, as Wolin always tends to be. So if you take a look at the chapter 12 notes, you see what I've done here. I've gone ahead, and what I tell you is that, the main thing, the main task that Wolin is trying to accomplish in chapter 12 of his book is that he is trying to blow up. He is trying to destroy four persistent myths that have developed over time in media, in pop culture, even in a lot of academic analyses about Karl Marx. Because Marx, I think especially because Marx is seen as being the father of communism, because Marx is seen as being the biggest sort of intellectual, ideological inspiration for the creation of the Soviet Union and Soviet communism from 1917 until the late 80s, when the Soviet Union fell apart. And for more details, take Poli-Sci 2, comparative politics, right? Marx is seen as the ideological, intellectual inspiration for Soviet communism, for Chinese communism starting in the 1940s, and for any other political system around the world that has at some point called itself communist. Okay? Now, quick thing for me to say about that. Most political systems, whether it's the Soviet Union, now dead and buried, the Chinese communist system that still exists today, communism in Cuba, communism in North Korea, communism in North Vietnam, pretty much every communist system that has existed in the world, whether still going or dead, basically they're communist in name only. If we could dig up Karl Marx and reanimate him and have him take a look at governments around the world that call themselves communists, he would be horrified. He would be mortified. He would say, no. That's not what I was predicting in my philosophical models. Those folks are just a bunch of brutal dictators, a bunch of authoritarian and totalitarian thugs. So Marx would take absolutely no ownership on any communist system that has existed in the world or still exists today. Okay? That's kind of my starting point. And that's kind of Wollen's starting point too, because what Wollen does is he spends chapter 12, among other things, blowing up 4 of the biggest myths, 4 of the biggest misconceptions that we have about Marx. Most Americans grow up and are trained to hate Marx. Why? Because they see him as the father of communism, the father of what happened in the Soviet Union and Cuba and China. Bad, 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 evil, evil, evil. Now, I'm not here saying that Marx was right. I'm not here endorsing his theories. But what I'm saying is that, as Wollen talks about in chapter 12, if you want a lot of insight about how various political, economic, and social systems have evolved in the world over time, you want to pay attention to what Marx had to say. Marx's philosophical model is really interesting and really interestingly predictive up to a point. So look at the 4 myths that Wollen blows up in chapter 12. Myth number 1, Marxian ideas have not been relevant since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not true. And he explains why, and I explain briefly why in the notes. Myth number 2, Marxian philosophy categorically condemns capitalism. That Marx has been seen by so many as being the enemy of capitalism. Not true. And he talks about it, and I talk about it in the notes. Myth number 3, the concept of globalization, that is increasing economic interconnection by all societies, all economic systems in the world, that was first discovered by contemporary economists like Thomas Friedman. False. Marx initially came up with the idea of globalization. Wollen talks about that. I talk about that. And the final myth, Marx rejected democracy as a viable system of political organization. Not true. Marx sees capitalism and he sees democracy as being necessary and inevitable steps that we see in the progression, in the progress of all societies in the world. So take a look at chapter 12 through the lens. You don't need to read every last detail in chapter 12 because your head will spin. But kind of skim through chapter 12 with these 4 myths in mind that Wollen is trying to blow up in the chapter. All right? And if you have more questions about Marx, we can take a few minutes next Monday and talk about them. If you have, you could also send me an email, send me a Canvas message, stop by during my virtual student hours on Zoom, whatever you need. So I'm going to wrap up because I am running over time. I apologize for that. But here's the deal. You know what's going on. Make sure you're up on the schedule. Make sure you're getting your assignments completed in a timely way, at least within the grace period. And if you have any questions about anything having to do with the class the rest of the way through, or if there's anything else that has even nothing to do with this class that you think I can help you with, please reach out to me. See me on email, see me on Canvas, see me on Zoom. Because guess what? For this class and for everything in your life, you are not alone. I'm here. I've got your back. So thanks for joining me today. Until I talk to you again, be safe, take care, and know I'm always here for you. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.